Ma'am, I'm going to need to see your boarding pass. The words dropped from the flight attendant's lips like an accusation, not a request. The black woman, already seated in 1A, looked up slowly from her Kindle. She wasn't startled, just tired. The kind of tired that comes from having the same conversation in 1,000 different ways over the course of 1,000 different days. She handed over the slip of paper without a word. Her bag had already been stowed, her coat folded neatly. She wore tailored slacks, a beige cashmere sweater, gold hoops, and no makeup except for a wine-colored lipstick that said, "I didn't come to impress you." She had been the first to board. She had nodded politely to the cabin crew. She had followed the rules. But still, here they were. The white flight attendant scanned the ticket, lips tightening. The seat was correct. First class, assigned, paid for. But that wasn't what she was looking for. She was looking for confirmation that this woman belonged here, not on paper, visually, socially, economically. She didn't find it. "This is correct," she said, voice tight, as though the paper had betrayed her. The black woman offered a small nod, then returned to her screen. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. The flight attendant lingered, adjusted her posture, glanced down the aisle, then back again, as if hoping to find backup in the eyes of the other passengers. A few nearby had already paused their conversations. A middle-aged white couple seated in 1C and 1D were now clearly watching. The man shifted, amused. The woman whispered something behind her hand. Further back in economy, boarding continued. But up front, the air had already shifted. The flight attendant leaned slightly closer, lowering her voice. "I just needed to confirm, we've had some mix-ups before." A polite lie. The black woman didn't respond. She didn't need to. She just adjusted the armrest and crossed one leg over the other. The flight attendant straightened and walked off, her posture stiff with indignation. A man across the aisle, salt and pepper hair, tailored blazer, wedding ring too tight, cleared his throat and smirked. He didn't say anything, but the message was clear in his eyes. "She caught you slipping." The black woman remained still, not cold, not smug, just silent. She had nothing to prove. The engines began their low growl beneath the floor. Outside the window, the runway shimmered under the early sun. Boarding announcements buzzed in the background. She slipped her Kindle back into her bag and pulled out a laptop. The screen lit up. A logo appeared. Her company's. The email thread she opened read, "Meeting confirmed, exec team in flight. CEO already en route." The same CEO now sipping orange juice in seat 1A. But the cabin crew didn't know that yet. Neither did the man across the aisle. They just knew she didn't look like first class. And that, as always, was the mistake. The ticket had already been scanned. Seat 1A, no errors, no mix-up, no explanation needed. But still, the white flight attendant held on to it for a beat too long, eyes flicking from the printed seat number to the woman in the chair, as if double-checking the rules of reality. Then, without a word, she handed it back. No apology, no smile, no thank you for your patience. Just a sharp pivot and the squeak of her shoes on the cabin floor as she walked away, stiff and muttering something into her shoulder mic, as if the confirmation hadn't satisfied her, as if the seat was hers and not earned. Across the aisle, the businessman finally let his smirk bloom into sound. A soft chuckle, tight and smug, not loud enough to be called out, just loud enough to land. He didn't even bother to look away when the woman turned her head. He just raised his eyebrows and tapped at the keyboard on his iPad like she was a cartoon in his peripheral vision. A novelty. She looked at him for 1 second longer than necessary, not long enough to start something, but long enough to make sure he saw that she'd clocked it. Then she turned back to her own space, unfolded her tray table, and placed her laptop down with deliberate care. The man had no idea she was the reason for his flight. She didn't need to tell him. The cabin around her continued to fill, but her row felt frozen, like the tension had built its own weather. The couple behind her whispered. A flight attendant offered champagne to a different passenger first, even though she'd been seated the longest. And through it all, she remained still, shoulders relaxed, face unreadable. But inside, something had shifted. Not rage, not even resentment. Just that clean, cold mental click of noted. She powered on her laptop. The glow of the screen lit her face as the airline's Wi-Fi connected, her inbox loaded with the familiar rhythm of demand. Proposal drafts, funding schedules, a slide deck waiting for review. She tapped a few keys, scrolled, then stopped. One message. Subject line, final attendee confirmation. CEO. Present, she smiled faintly. The irony was so sharp it almost made her laugh. Because yes, she was present, sitting quietly in first class, in heels she paid for herself, with a company she built from scratch, surrounded by people who still couldn't imagine that someone like her had every right to be here, not just as a guest, but as the one they were flying for. Another ding. See you soon, boss. She closed the message. The flight attendant passed again, this time without eye contact. She didn't mind. There would be plenty of that later. For now, she opened the deck and started working, preparing the slides that half the passengers in first class would pretend to understand once they realized whose name was on them. Her posture stayed elegant, her hands steady, her silence louder than the chuckles. Because some people show you who they are before the flight ever takes off. And she always remembers. Somewhere over Colorado, the cabin lights dimmed to a soft blue, and the cabin hushed into that mid-flight quiet, the kind that makes every sound a little sharper. The rustle of newspapers, the clink of ice in a glass, the occasional cough, all suddenly seemed louder against the white noise of the engines. The black woman in seat 1A hadn't moved much since takeoff. Her laptop was still open, screen casting a glow across her face. A spreadsheet now, formulas and projections swimming across the cells. Numbers most people in the cabin wouldn't understand, even if they tried. 2 rows ahead, a white man in a tailored blue suit shifted in his seat, checked his phone for the 4th time in 5 minutes. His email refreshed. A bolded message popped up at the top of the screen. Meeting moved up, Kolkword. CEO is on your flight. Prep for early discussion. He sat straighter, scanned the names, his brow furrowed. Then he froze. There was only one woman near the front who wasn't part of his team. She was working, quietly, no assistant, no fuss. Her presence, he realized too late, hadn't been background noise. It had been the headline. His eye slid toward her again, slower this time, focused. She felt it before he spoke. The shift in temperature, the change in weight. He cleared his throat. Excuse me. She looked up calmly, cursor blinking beside a cell that read, Q3 revenue forecast. I just got the update, he said, eyes flicking to her screen, then quickly back to her face. You're the CEO of... She tilted her head slightly. Yes. That was all. She didn't extend a hand. She didn't smile. She let the silence answer the rest. His face flushed, not red, pale, like something had drained from him and hadn't yet returned. He tried to recover. We weren't told you'd be. Well, I assumed the exec team would be flying in together. They are, she said. I don't fly with entourages. He gave a tight chuckle that didn't land anywhere. Of course, smart, efficient. She turned back to her screen. The rest of the first-class cabin pretended not to watch, but they heard it, every word. And suddenly, the quiet black woman in 1A was no longer a curiosity, or an accidental seat assignment, or a question mark. She was the meeting, the subject, the boss, the one they were prepping slides for. A woman in 1B tried to glance discreetly at her, then looked away. A man diagonally behind them shifted in his seat. Someone pulled up her company name on their phone under the tray table. And the businessman beside her? He didn't speak again for the rest of the flight. She went back to work, not with vindication, but with purpose. Because this wasn't about proving them wrong anymore. It was about reminding herself that they had never known what right looked like to begin with. The plane touched down in smooth silence, rubber-kissing runway. The usual shuffle began. Seatbelts clicked, laptops closed, carry-ons yanked from overhead bins with impatience. The black woman in seat 1. A didn't move. She let the rush pass her like a wave, eyes still scanning the final numbers on her screen. When she finally stood, she moved with intention. No hurry, no wasted motion. She gathered her coat, her bag, her silence. The man who'd questioned her hours earlier was already half a row ahead, suddenly unsure whether to wait for her or keep walking. He chose the latter. The terminal buzzed with arrival energy. Announcements overhead, people checking phones, the soft slap of rolling suitcases. She walked through it untouched, heels clicking softly against the polished tile as she entered the executive lounge. The glass doors slid open without hesitation. No one asked her for credentials. Inside, her team had already arrived. They stood when they saw her, a ripple of recognition and relief. The same men who had once forwarded her emails to each other without reading them now stood a little too straight, a little too eager. She nodded once in greeting, sat down at the end of the long walnut table. The seat left open for her was the only one without a water bottle, because everyone had assumed she wouldn't show. Now they were scrambling. She didn't need to speak loudly. She never did. Her tone was even, smooth, unhurried. But when she opened her mouth, everyone leaned in. "We're trimming phase 2 by 2 weeks," she said, scrolling through the slides they hadn't seen yet. "Funding will close sooner than expected. Marketing needs to pivot. The investors want vision, not speed. We're giving them both." One man began to nod before she finished. Another opened his laptop, eyes darting between the screen and her face like he was studying scripture. Across the table, the executive who'd sat a few rows ahead of her on the plane, the one who'd glanced past her like she didn't exist, couldn't stop adjusting his tie. His voice, when he finally spoke, cracked slightly. "Understood. We'll get the team aligned. You'll lead the presentation?" She looked up, her eyes unreadable. "Of course." It wasn't a question. The door to the lounge opened again, and in the corner of her eye, she saw the flight attendant pass by, still in uniform, still avoiding her gaze. She didn't stop, didn't speak, just walked past the floor-to-ceiling glass wall with quick steps, arms tucked close, face tight. But the flicker of recognition was unmistakable. The woman she'd dismissed was now seated at a table surrounded by executives, giving orders, shaping outcomes, speaking softly, while every man in the room held his breath. There was no apology, no sudden reversal, just the quiet knowing that the hierarchy had shifted, and that everyone felt it. She didn't watch the flight attendant go, didn't need to. She simply turned another slide, and the room followed. They didn't put it in writing, no press release, no apology email, just quiet corrections, whispered meetings, policy reviews framed as internal initiatives. The kind of institutional backpedaling that only happens when someone powerful says nothing at all, because the silence speaks louder than any headline. Her story circulated in the way powerful stories do, not with hashtags, but with heat. A ripple through HR departments and executive group chats, conference tables in glass towers, and Slack threads labeled urgent. No one dared name names, but they all knew. The woman in 1A, the CEO, the one they dismissed, the one who didn't flinch when she was questioned, the one who didn't raise her voice, but raised the standard. The airline's corporate team held a meeting 2 weeks later, not because she threatened to sue, but because one of their own staff had typed, "She was the CEO," into a Slack channel, and that message got screenshotted and shared. Again and again, the team reviewed footage. They saw the moment she was asked to prove she belonged, saw the eyes of passengers glance up, saw the way she remained composed, even when dignity was being tested in public. But she never tweeted about it, never made a statement, because she didn't need to. She had the kind of power that doesn't have to shout, the kind that already knows the boardrooms she owns, the valuations she controls, the entire teams that answer when she calls. She didn't need revenge. She had receipts. And the story followed her wherever she flew next. Flight crews began to triple-check their tone when greeting women who walked onto the plane in silence and elegance. The way they looked, the way they moved, the way they carried themselves with just enough poise to signal, "This isn't my first time here. Don't make it your first mistake today." She still flew commercial sometimes, not because she couldn't afford otherwise, but because she liked watching the room shift, liked the way subtle arrogance cracked under quiet confidence. Now, when she boarded early, there were no glances, no double checks, just open paths and straight backs. First class wasn't just where she sat. It was how she walked, how she worked, how she waited. The businessman who once smirked at her now used her name in keynotes. True leadership, he said, as if he'd always known. The flight attendant who questioned her? She wasn't fired, she was retrained, quietly reassigned to a different route. She never saw her again. But the next time she boarded a plane, a different attendant smiled at her and said, "Welcome back, Miss _________. We've been expecting you." She smiled politely, took her seat, opened her laptop, logged into the meeting they were flying toward. And as the plane lifted off the runway, she didn't think about vindication. She thought about altitude. Because once you rise above the noise, you never have to explain how you got there.